All right, question. How many of you saw the USA men's hockey team win the gold a few weeks ago? Anybody see that? Yeah, it was absolutely stunning, wasn't it? My favorite part was the interview after the game when they interviewed Jack Hughes, the center who actually scored the goal. I mean, yeah, look at it. It was amazing. He's missing his front teeth. There's blood everywhere. They start interviewing him, and it's just stunning. He's just like, I love the USA. This was for America. This gold is for our country. I mean, he was off the chart excited about that victory, and it was so obvious. And you probably know, but this is the first time that we've won the gold in hockey since 1980, what was known as the Miracle on Ice. And this made my family go back and watch. I don't know if you watched the movie before, Miracle. They made a movie about that 1980 victory over the Russians, right? Poor Russians. I feel like all of my childhood memories, the Russians were always the bad guys. And that movie is no different. And they made a movie about it. And I noticed this time, one of the scenes in the very beginning of the movie, they had Coach Herb Brooks. They were interviewing him for the role, for the job of being the coach for the Olympian team. And he came into this meeting, and he brought his paperwork, and he brought all these plays and playbooks and kind of presented them to the other coaches. And they looked at it, and they said, Herb, this isn't American hockey. Like, this is not the way that we play the game. What are you doing? This won't work at all. And then Herb Brooks, the coach, he looked at all these other men in the room, and in this very strong Minnesota accent, he looks at them and he says, guys, if we're going to win, we got to do it a different way. So he said, we got to do it a different way. And then the rest of the movie is all these young hockey players learning a brand new way to approach the game of hockey and struggling through it and learning. And he says, guys, we got to do it a different way if we're going to win. Now, if I had to sum up 1 Timothy chapter 5 for you today, I would say Paul's heart here. His insistence here could be summed up in the same words of Coach Herb Brooks when he says, guys, if we're going to win, we got to do it a different way. That's what he's showing us here in this chapter. I think this is exactly what we see, a different way to live in the family of God, so that we can be the healthiest possible church and so that the gospel of Jesus can continue to spread, not just across our city, but literally around the world. So Paul's going to do two things today. He's going to show us, first of all, what it looks like to relate to one another in the family of God. And then he's going to show us what it looks like to care for one another in the family of God. And I think this is, man, the more I've read through this passage, the first time I read through 1 Timothy 5, I felt like, what are we going to even talk about? And then the more I studied this, the more I'm like, oh, this is actually so helpful and so relevant for so many of us. All right, particularly maybe two groups of people I'll speak to first this morning. One, for those of you who feel like I'm actually really new to Christianity, or I'm exploring this right now, I'm not even entirely sure what it is that I believe about Jesus, this is actually a great glimpse into what life as a Christian looks like. Right? Because for some of you, I know you often feel like you come to a church like this and you're like, I feel like I'm just like walking into somebody else's house and I'm not really sure how to orient myself. I'm not sure like what I'm supposed to do or what I'm supposed to say. And it's like, I get it. That's great. We love that you're here. And this is going to help you understand this is what life is like as a Christian. Now, the other group of people are those of you who maybe you grew up in the church, but maybe as you look back on your church experience, you would say, you know what? I kind of had a hard church background. Or I had a really confusing church background. Or some of you, I had a kind of an abusive church background. And what I would say to you this morning is that this is where 1 Timothy 5 is actually a gift. It's going, I think maybe more than anything, it's going to give you God's vision for what life in the local church ought to be. And that's maybe just what some of you need today. Is like you need to see, well, what does God say the church should be like? What does God say this is how we should function together as a family? You know, we've said this almost every week of this year, is that this year we have a goal for you. We have a prayer for you. We have a hope for every single one of you, and that is that this year you would learn the secret to thoroughly enjoying God. That's what we want for you. We want you to be the type of man or the type of woman who's like, I know what it's like to thoroughly enjoy God. One of the best ways for you to thoroughly enjoy God is by properly enjoying his church. And that's what we've been trying to show you as we've walked through 1 Timothy as a series, and we're going to continue that today. Now, we're going to dive into chapter 5 this morning, but just one more FYI before we do that. Originally, I was going to cover chapter 3 a few weeks ago, I'm going to do that next week. All right. I know I was trying to do too many things. I was trying to combine those together. Didn't have enough time to do all of that. So I'm going to come back next week to do chapter 3. I know, like so many of you have been sitting on the edges of your seat just waiting for that. Come back next week and you'll see chapter 3. I'm going to teach that. But today we're going to do chapter 5. We're going to work through that together and then we're going to go backwards. All right. So that's just a little bit of a preview for next week. Today we're going to start in verse 1 of chapter 5. Here's what Paul says when it comes to relating to one another within the family of God. He says this, he says, do not rebuke an older man, but encourage him as you would a father, younger men as brothers, older women as mothers, younger women as sisters in all purity. Now, what you're seeing here is Paul uses all of this familial language, right? It's like mothers and fathers and brothers and sisters. And what I want you to notice here is what Paul's doing in verses 1 and 2. This is like an HR nightmare. Right? Why? Because, what does Paul say? What he's basically saying here is don't treat everybody the same. Right? Now, here's the thing. This is one of the ways, if you want to be a good Bible reader, if you want to be like a healthy Bible reader, one of the questions that you can ask anytime that you're reading the Bible that I think will just open up your world to understanding the scriptures is, after you read something, ask yourself the question, how has the world twisted this today? How is the culture that I live in right now, like twisted this to mean something different than what was written here? You begin asking that question, it will open up your world to all kinds of different ways to understand the Bible. Look at it, verses 1 and 2. He says something wildly unpopular today. Treat people differently. And he goes even further. He says, treat people differently based on their age and their sex. Treat men differently than women. Treat women differently than men. Treat old people differently than young people. It's like, whoa, Paul, I'm not sure you're allowed to say that. Right? Now, to be clear, this is very, very important. What Paul is not saying here is to treat certain groups better than other groups or to treat certain groups as more important than other groups. He's not saying that. Why? Because Paul knows, and we know, that all of us, everyone, male or female, old or young, regardless of race, regardless of ethnicity, regardless of ability. This is what Christians have been at the forefront of this all throughout history. All of us are made in the image of God. All of us then, regardless of how we're different, we are still given the same equal dignity, value, meaning, and purpose. This is what it means to be made in the image of God. We know that. Paul knows that. Yet, still, he says, in this family, we treat one another differently. Now, why would he say that? Well, first of all, I want you to notice something here. I want you to notice something that it seems like Paul assumes in verses 1 and 2. When he says older men and younger men and older women and younger women, what is he assuming? Paul is assuming a multi-generational church, isn't he? That's just kind of like a working assumption for Paul when it comes to the family of God. He says in the church that there should be old people and young people. There should be men and women. And a couple verses later, he's going to show us how there are going to be married people and unmarried people. Now, this is fascinating to me because, it feels like if you think about this in the church today, the local church might be one of the last remaining places in America where you've got all different types of people from different generations and different ages and different seasons and stages of life, all coming together, interacting with one another personally, intimately. Have you thought about that? Where else can you go and interact with, on a consistent basis, babies and senior citizens and everything else in between in a personal and intimate way? It feels like it's only the family of God. And it's almost, for some people, this can almost be like a disorienting thing at times, right? I feel this often. I'll tell you how I know this is true, because on almost any given Sunday, when I meet somebody who's new to our church, maybe I'll be in the lobby out there having a conversation with somebody. This is typically what happens. I'll give you an example. Just for example, if I meet somebody who's like a young single woman, and it's her first time to our church, one of the first things that I almost always hear her say is like, wow, there's so many kids here. Like there's so many babies, or there's so many married people here. And if I meet a married couple, especially an older married couple it's their very first time in our church, you know what they say? There's so many young people here. Like, look at all the kids here. Why is it? Why does it almost feel like it's hardwired into us to see the opposite of where we're at? I think it's because there's just something a little bit disorienting about seeing all the different people from different generations and different parts of that spectrum integrated and intimately connected. It's only in the family of God that we see this. So what does Paul say here? He says, verse 1, do not rebuke an older man. Now that word rebuke, it's kind of a unique word. It means like to speak harshly. Now why? Why would Paul specifically say here, don't speak harshly to older men? Well, probably on one hand, it's to lay a foundation of respect, right? He's like, okay, in this family, here's how we do it. Like, we want to respect our elders. We want to speak respectfully to them, and I'm helping you just think about that. At the same time, I thought about this a lot this week. Like, why would Paul draw specific attention to that? Why would he need to say this? And it made me think about how a lot of older men today, I think at some point, men come to a place in their lives, a point in their life where they're able to actually see their lives clearly for what it is and for what it has been. Okay, it's a very hard thing to do that when you're younger. Like when you're in the middle of it, when you're in the grind, it's really hard to see like, what is my life? What is my life all about? But when you get a little bit older, that's when you begin to see it a little bit more clearly. I think, so for example, I think when you have a kid, like when you become a dad, you start to get a little bit of perspective. You start to see that a little bit more. Like, oh, okay, I'm starting to see my life a little bit more. I think actually it becomes even more so when you become a grandfather, or at least that age. When you get to that age in your life, when you're, okay, now I'm starting to really see my life for what it is, like the second half of life. Now, here's the hard thing for us today. I don't know if you realize this, but there are fewer grandparents today than in any other previous generation. And the reason why is really obvious. Is because young adults today, more than any other previous generation, are having fewer and fewer kids or not having any kids at all. And some of you know this because your parents continually nag you. When are you going to give me some grandbabies, right? And here's the reality then. As a result of this, you have parents who are in their 50s, 60s, 70s who have never become grandparents, and they're looking at their lives saying, oh, this is my legacy. This is the fruit of my life. And sometimes, okay, let me take this even a level deeper here. Sometimes, when it comes to grandparents have the unique privilege that only comes with being a grandparent. Sometimes, okay? I'm not saying this is always the case, don't hear that. But sometimes, grandparents have the unique privilege of being able to say, what I didn't get right with my kids, I'm going to get right with my grandkids. Right? Where I messed it up. Or I just didn't do a great job. Where I got it wrong, I'm not going to get it wrong again. Right? And some of you know this. You've seen this. Some of you have little kids, and you're like, wow, my parents act so much differently towards them than they did me. Like, where was that when I was a kid growing up? Right? And what is that? I mean, ultimately, that's a second chance. Parents are given this unique second chance as grandparents, which is amazing because in some sense, it's a beautiful picture of the gospel. Right? Except for in the gospel, we're not just given second chances. We're given whole new beginnings. God comes to us. I mean, this is a beautiful thing about becoming a follower of Jesus. Jesus comes to you, and he looks at all the areas of your life and all the areas where you've messed it up, where you haven't done well, where you screwed up, and he's like, hey, let's look at all the areas where you have failed, and let's start again. Like, let's begin again together. That's why we call the gospel such good news. Right? It's looking at all those areas of life. It's not just a second chance. It's a whole new beginning. And I think when Paul says here, do not rebuke an older man, but encourage him as you would a father. I don't know. Maybe just one of the recognitions here is that the people that you assume are least in need of encouragement are actually way more needing encouragement than we tend to assume. Like you look at certain people in your life and like, yeah, especially older people. I mean, why do you think there's a stereotype of grumpy old men, right? And bitter old women? What we're seeing is like we live in a generation that loves to critique and criticize and complain about older people, especially older men. And Paul's going to say right here, not in this family. That's not how we do it here. Like we're actually going to encourage older men. We're going to help them see how valuable they are to this family. I mean, even that, think about that word, encourage. Like the literal etymology of that word is to instill courage into a person. So you look at maybe some of the older men in our lives and say, hey, how can I instill courage into you? How can I help you see and understand, like, there's still work to be done? You don't have to check out. We still value you. You have a place here. That's what Paul is trying to help us see. And then he goes on, and he says, do not rebuke an older man, but encourage him as you would a father. And then he says, younger men as brothers. Now, I think the point here is, and this is why I love to encourage you to read the Bible. All right, read the Bible. It's filled with so many good things. Here's what Paul's saying. He's pushing back against the radical individualism that we all tend to adopt, especially as we get older. What do I mean by that? I just mean, I think there's something when you're young. All right, guys understand, and girls understand this too. I mean, this is kind of for both men and women. I'm going to talk to the guys, though, for a minute, because that's who Paul's addressing right here. He says, encourage young men as brothers. And what are brothers known for? All right, especially when they're young. What are they known for? They're just, some of you have brothers, right? Anybody have a brother? I've got 3 brothers, right? I got a lot of brothers. And you know what's wild about having brothers? Even when you don't like your brothers, they're still your brothers. Right? There's like a unique bond that still exists there regardless of how things are going on the surface. In fact, I was thinking about that this week, and I was reminded of, as I was just reflecting on that reality, I felt like the Lord brought to mind a certain memory from my childhood. I hadn't thought about this in probably 15 years, but I was reminded of this as I was writing this part of my sermon. And I was thinking back to one summer when I was in probably 7th grade. And I remember I was with all my brothers, and not just my brothers, but actually all the neighborhood boys. I grew up in a neighborhood that tons of families, tons of kids. And one day we were playing football in our front yard. My brothers were there, my friends were there, and my older brother was there. And my older brother is 4 years older than me. And to be honest, at that time in our lives, we just didn't get along a whole lot. I mean, he was in a very different place. He was kind of in a hard place, and we just had different interests, and we just didn't like each other that much. So we didn't really have a close friendship. We didn't have a close relationship at all. We really didn't like each other that much. And I remember that day we were playing football. Guys, I thought about this. I feel like God gave me this memory. I literally, as I reflect, I started crying in my office. I was like weeping. This was such a powerful moment. Because I remember my brother, he passed me the football. And I started sprinting across our yard. I'm just running. I'm running, and then I'm coming across one of the other kids in our neighborhood who's on the other team, who was a real punk. And I remember trying to pass him, and at just the moment that I go to pass him, he sticks out his arm. He literally clotheslines me. It was like a cartoon. My feet go up in the air. I come crashing down on my back. I mean, it was like game over in that moment. And I hit the ground. And in that very moment, my older brother chased down that guy. And he threw him to the ground and just started pounding him and pounding him and pounding him over and over and over. Why? Because that's just what brothers do, right? Even when you don't like each other, like you love each other, right? Even when there's conflict, you fight for each other. That's just baked into, I mean, it's like hardwired into brotherhood. And what Paul is saying is that's the kind of family God is creating. Right? Not unnecessary violence, but just saying that brotherhood, that willingness to say, like, all right, you might not always like each other. You might not always agree with each other, but you love each other. You stand up for each other. You fight for each other even when you disagree. It's part of being the family of God. It's this bond. It runs so deep, and it's vital for your health. It's vital for your future. Guys, I share that because I hope for maybe just even the men in the room today, if you don't have that, you have got to find that. I mean, it is absolutely vital for your success. You cannot do this alone. Right, there's a reason why Paul tells us this over and over and over all throughout the scriptures, that Christianity was never intended to be a solo sport. It's a team sport. We do this together with other men in your corner, supporting you, caring for you, holding you accountable, seeing you grow, encouraging you along the way. If you do not have that, at some point you are going to fall. This is why we do everything in our power to help provide that for you in this church family. And so if you don't have that, we would just love to help you find that. Even today, come see me afterwards. I'd love to have a conversation how we can help you get into that. Now, Paul continues on with that, and he makes a little bit of a shift here in verse 2 and begins to address the women. Look what he says. He says, treat older women as mothers, younger women as sisters in all purity. Now, again, this is where it's really helpful. Just remember what Paul has already told us leading up to this point in the book of 1 Timothy about God's heart. All right, every week we see Paul do this in a different way. From the very beginning, he tells us in chapter 1, for example, that Jesus Christ came to save sinners. And then we get into chapter 2, and he says, God, our Savior, desires that all people will be saved. And the whole point here is very simple. Every one of us needs to be saved. It's kind of our fundamental need as humans, to be saved. Now, I realize that word saved, for some of you, you hear that, and it's like, okay, I remember hearing that a lot growing up. That feels kind of like an old-fashioned word to our modern ears, but here's the reality. The Bible insists on using it because it's honest about our human condition, that we're not just people who need advice, right? We're not just people who need more information. We're literally people who need to be rescued. We need to be saved. Saved from what? Well, the Bible actually has a pretty comprehensive understanding of what that's supposed to look like for us. And well, we know, first of all, we need to be saved from our sin. Our sin is the very thing that separates us from God. And the scriptures say we need to be saved from that. We also need to be saved from ourselves. Right? Our natural proclivity, our natural tendency is to want to play God rather than to love God or enjoy God. We need to be saved out of that. We also need to be saved from the world, or the world around us that is so often preaching to you a message and often a lie about here's how you can find the good life apart from God. A cheap imitation of what is true. So every one of us needs to be saved. But here's the important thing. When Paul talks about salvation, he's not just talking about things that we need to be saved from. He's also telling us that we're saved into something like a new family, a spiritual family called the church. And so you have to recognize when Paul's writing this letter, here's the challenge. All right, just put yourself in this position for just a moment. Here's the challenge. Think about this. You got all these men and women in the city of Ephesus. They're going through their 20s and their 30s and their 40s, and they were living under a different story. A story that told them sex, for example, is just like another appetite in life, right? When you're hungry, you eat. When you're tired, you sleep. When you want sex, you just go take it. There was absolutely no sexual dignity in that world. Women were constantly objectified. It's honestly not that different from today. But then what happened? Well, we know what happened, don't we? Christians began moving into the city. They began moving into the city of Ephesus, not because it was convenient or easy or desirable. No, it was actually known for being a really, really dark place. But they believed something. They literally believed there are people here in our city, apart from the saving work of Jesus, they will die and spend eternity in hell apart from God unless we do something about it. And they made it their ambition to begin sharing the gospel, like telling other people about Jesus. Like we're gonna speak the gospel. We're gonna tell people this is what you need to know. This is what you need to understand. This is what you need to believe. And as a result, what happened? The gospel began to spread. Literally, it just started moving its way through a city. Like men and women all across the city began to hear about Jesus and how Jesus died for sinners, how he was raised from the dead so that it could be victorious over our greatest enemies in this life, sin, Satan, death, and hell. And if you believe that, you can have new life in Christ. Men and women everywhere started hearing that. And they're like, all right, I believe. I want that. I want to follow Jesus in that way. And that's what started happening. And particularly when it came then to life in this new family, you have to think about what this was like for them, especially when it came to topics like sex, dating, marriage. They're like, how do we do that? Like, what does that look like in this new family? Which I love that because so many of you have asked that same question. I've sat down with many of you over the years. You come into our church and you're like, I just became a Christian and I'm learning how to follow Jesus. And I've never been in a Christian relationship before. Like, how do I do this as a Christian? Because I've only known this, I've only known dates to go this way, but I feel like maybe I need to change some of that. And Paul would say, yeah, you're probably right. In fact, I love what Paul says here. You kind of think about it. If that was the question, how do we date? How do we engage women? How do we pursue? It's like, Here's what Paul says, very simply. Here's how you do it. You treat women like sisters. You honor them with purity. That's all he says, right? He doesn't even really go beyond that. Not here, at least. I mean, there's plenty of other places where he talks about, all the things that we should do. But right here, it was almost as if maybe Paul thought, for the men of this church, maybe it's enough for me to say, hey, all you need to know, all you need to understand when it comes to relating to women is to treat them like sisters. And if you can do that, that might give you a path. That might give you a framework for all the other decisions you have to make down the road. I mean, it's easy, right? It's kind of like the question is would you do that with your sister? Then don't do it, or if okay. It's like, that was the framework. It's all he said. He's like, that's how you understand what it looks like to be a part of this family. What is he doing here? He's giving us a brand new way of relating to one another as a family that's been changed by the grace of Jesus. And he says, therefore, okay, you've been changed by Jesus. Now this is the way that you relate to one another. You allow that same grace to change the relationships that you have with one another. You model the gospel in the way that you pursue men and women within this family. But it's not just about how we relate, right? He then kind of moves. Paul moves here. He shifts in verse 3 to from relating to one another to caring for one another. Look at verse 3. He says here, honor widows who are truly widows. What's he telling us here? What he's basically saying here is guys, as the church grows, very real problems are going to begin to emerge within the life of your church family. Very real needs are going to begin increasing within your church family. You need a wise and strategic way to be able to deal with all the needs that you're going to have. And he starts with widows. Now, you hear that? For most of us in the room here, you hear that and you're like, widows? Why widows? Do we even have any widows in our church? And why in the world would Paul spend 14 verses talking about widows? And the answer is actually twofold. The first reason, if you read the Bible, starting at the very beginning, you'll very quickly learn that God has such an extraordinary, unique love for widows. I mean, his heart is just tied to them. Psalm 68 tells us that he is a defender of the widow. I mean, that's just how his love goes towards them. When I think about that, and it's hard for me not to think about my grandmother. My grandmother is a picture of her. Adorable, right? Yeah, she's precious. She actually passed away just last year. It's okay. She lived a very long life. 104 years old is how old she was when she died. Okay, so she lived this extraordinary life, very, very active. I mean, literally to the day she died, she was going to the gym multiple times a week. And sometimes she was driving herself. And we're like, Grandma, you cannot be driving to the gym. You're 104 years old. And we said, well, there's all kinds of, we can get ride shares. We can get you a ride to the gym. And she goes, I don't want somebody to drive me to the gym. I want people to go with me to the gym. What is that? That's a desire for friendship, isn't it? One of the really hard things about aging, getting older, is not only do we lose friends, I mean, we lose that relational intimacy, don't we? I mean, also another part of growing older and aging is that not only the relational intimacy, but we also, for some people, begin to lose that sense of purpose. What am I doing with my life? I used to do so many things, and now I find myself I'm not doing anything. And it's very hard to exist within that. And I think what Paul's showing us here, a lot of what Paul's about to say here about widows, he's not going to just tell us, here's how we care for them. Actually, what he's going to show us is here's how we give dignity to them. It's an important part of life in the family. How do we give dignity to those who often don't have it? I mean, it's sad, but that is often a lost value in our culture today. Right, you think about this when the reality is old people today have become a burden. Right, old people have become a problem to solve instead of a blessing to care for. And then this is challenging. I mean, especially if we think about our cultural moment right now where so many of us, we live far away from our parents. Denver especially is a city where we've got more transplants than almost any other city. And we move away from our parents. And then as we get older, especially if we're just being honest, as we grow in our careers and then we find our parents who are aging, it's how do we balance these things? It's very complex today. So that's the first part of I think what Paul's speaking into here. But secondly, I think something deeper is happening. Paul's raising the question, what does it look like to care for people who are often on the margins or in very different stages of life that we are currently in? Because let's be honest, our natural tendency is the very opposite, right? We tend to surround ourselves with people who are just like us. Same age, same stage, same season. But what Paul is saying here is no. Like the family of God, that's not the way it's supposed to work. This is why we do everything in our power to make things like our city groups or our Monday night groups to be as diverse as possible when it comes to multi-generational. We want to see you guys interacting with people who are not just like you. Right? And I understand how easy that is. And I understand why there's some value in that as well. You know, it's like when you're single, you want to be around single people. When you're married, you want to be around married people. You know, the parents who have the little kids, they're like, I just want to be around other people who understand how difficult this is. And like, I'm not sleeping at all. I want to be around people who understand that. You know what? And I get it. What Paul is showing us here, what the scriptures teach us, it's actually better for you to be around more people who are not like you. There's value in that. There's something important about it. I mean, this is why we think about all the groups. I think about even just some of the healthiest groups within the life of our church are often the groups that have the greatest diversity in age and stage. It's the groups that have got little babies and retired people and everything in between interacting with each other, saying, we are learning from one another. That's where our souls are at their best. So Paul then, here through chapter 5, he begins to walk the church through some really practical wisdom. Okay? Now, we don't have time to go through all of it. I'm not going to go through all of it today. I would encourage you to read it, though, because there's some really interesting things that Paul says here. I want to show you just a few, though, as we wrap up today. Look what he says in verse 4. He says, but if a widow has children or grandchildren, let them first learn to show godliness to their own household and to make some return to their parents, for this is pleasing in the sight of God. In other words, Paul says when someone in your church has a need, the first line of defense is who? The family. He says it's the family's responsibility, not the church, not the government to meet somebody's needs. It's the family itself. In fact, this might actually be the strongest thing that Paul says in 1 Timothy. If you skip down to verse 8, look what he says. He says, but if anyone does not provide for his relatives, and especially for members of his household, he has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. Yikes. What he's saying here, this is intense. Paul's basically saying, if you do not take care of your family, I'm not sure you're even a Christian. Because it feels like somebody who would understand the grace of the gospel, what Christ has done for us, that would then translate in us being extraordinarily generous and gracious towards our family. See, the neat thing about this is you take a step back for a second. The picture of a widow is actually a very powerful metaphor for all of us. Why? Well, what is a widow? And Paul tells us in verse 5. Look what he says. He says, she who is truly a widow. Now, you'd be like, wait a minute. What do you mean truly a widow? Like, aren't all widows the same? Well, it seems like Paul's like, well, not exactly. Right? Yeah, I mean, yes, they all share in the commonality of like, all right, they've lost a spouse. But he's like, but there's also something broader here, something deeper that's happening. Look what he says. She who is truly a widow, left all alone. That's the defining factor. Right? That's the defining factor in his mind. Somebody who is left all alone. Again, I mean, that's the really scary thing about aging. Again, a lot of us don't think about this because we're so young and it's not on our radar at all, but it's like, that's a scary thing about getting older. Like, what if I'm going to be all alone? What if I don't have anybody else to help take care of me? I thought about this myself even this week. What if my kids don't want to take care of me? It's like, what if they're like, nope, not my, like, here's a nursing home that you can go. It's like, oh man, I better be nicer to my kids. Like, I want them to want to be around me even when it's hard. And yeah, it just made me think, I mean, even this week we were talking about it, like Angela, my wife, she works on the neuro ICU floor, and she said we had a patient come in, had a stroke. We think he was alone by himself for 4 days before anybody noticed. Can you imagine that? How scary that is. So what is a widow? Like, what words would we use to describe that? Vulnerable, helpless, incapable, so needy. You know, you think about it that way, and you begin to realize, spiritually speaking, we are all widows, apart from the work of Christ, right? And this is why the good news of the gospel is such good news. We're told that God, because of his great love for the vulnerable, he stepped in and rescued us. He literally did what we were incapable of doing. He brought life from death. He restored us when we were incapable of restoring ourselves. He brought freedom where there was slavery. And only God is capable of doing that. That's the grace of the gospel. So again, you take a step back from all of this, and what Paul's really doing here is he's showing us, here's what the family of God is meant to look like when the gospel begins shaping a specific group of people. And if we're honest, I mean, here's the great thing about this. You read this passage, you read all the things that Paul talks about. Here's what the family ought to be doing. Here's how you ought to be living in the family. Here's all your responsibilities towards the older men and the younger men and the older women and the younger women and everything in between. And it's like, wow, I'm not sure we've done all of those things. Like, none of us have done those things perfectly, and you continue to read on these things, and it's like, oh, well, all of us have failed to love one another perfectly. All of us have failed to pursue purity perfectly. All of us have failed to care wisely for one another and graciously and to show up for one another and fight for one another instead of fighting against one another. That's exactly why the gospel is such good news for people like us, right? For us. He came to save sinners. You know, Jesus didn't come to gather a family of perfect people. He came to save sinners just like us and bring them into a new family where through his life, death, and resurrection, we can realize we're forgiven of our sin. We're brought into freedom. And when that starts to happen amongst us, this is the beauty of all of this. When we begin to put 1 Timothy 5 into practice, when we become the type of church that looks at one another and says, you matter and you are valuable and I want to love you in the very same way that Christ has loved me, you know what that does? Not only does that begin to so powerfully strengthen a church, I mean, it really does. If you're able to look at your brothers and sisters in this space, and it's just like, okay, this isn't just a crowd that I'm a part of. I'm not just a spectator here. This is my family. These are brothers and sisters. We belong to one another. I mean, it brings about this incredibly powerful strength to a church family. And at the same time, you know what else it does? To an outside watching world, they are able to get a glimpse of the kingdom of God firsthand. That's what happens. They're able to see, like, wow, this was what it really looks like to know the love of God. This is what it really looks like to be the family of God. We're literally putting on display the gospel by the way we love one another. I mean, that's exactly what Jesus says, right? In the Gospel of John, that you will be known by the way that you love each other. And this is our opportunity to be able to practice this as we look at one another, not as just spectators in a crowd, but as brothers and sisters in a family. Father, we thank you right now, even just for the family of God that you've given us. What a gift that is, a precious gift intended to be stewarded well. Jesus, we pray right now that maybe for some of us, for the very first time, we're thinking about this way when it comes to the church, that we are a people, we are a family, brothers and sisters, that you are our Heavenly Father. And for some of I feel this, God, that maybe some of the people in the room today, they've just never really been a part of that type of family. They've never experienced the love and the grace and the forgiveness and the safety that comes with being a part of a family that knows you. So, Father, I'm praying, I think right now, just maybe more than anything, that would you make that the most enticing thing for all of us today? Just the desire to be meaningfully connected to your family. That we would love so generously, because of your love for us. That we would fight for one another and not fight against one another. That we would be like those brothers. You know, even when we don't like each other, we love each other because of who Jesus is and what Jesus has done. God, I pray that you would grow that love for us and within us. I pray that as we move into this time of response, God, that this would be a time that we see you for who you truly are. That would draw within our hearts just the desire to worship you today. So God, we thank you for bringing us, saving us, not just from sin, not just from ourselves, not just from this world. God, you saved us into a family called the church. And I pray that we would steward that church well and that we would properly enjoy it in the way that you called us to. We're asking these things in your good, holy, high name. Amen.